Microsoft pushed out a Windows update in January 2026 that, for a meaningful number of users, either wrecked their gaming performance or left their machines unable to boot at all. Then, on February, Microsoft released a new update that was supposed to fix those boot failures, but that update introduced a whole new set of problems. Boot loops, broken login screens, lost network connections. This is not a one-off story. It is the latest chapter in what has become a recurring and deeply frustrating pattern. Over the next few minutes, we're going to go through what happened, who was affected, what Microsoft said, and what this keeps telling us about the state of Windows in 2026. Every month, Microsoft releases what it calls a Patch Tuesday update. Bundle of security fixes and system improvements pushed to Windows machines around the world. On January 13th, 2026, that update was designated KB507-4109. It targeted Windows 11 versions 24H2 and 25H2 and contained over 114 security vulnerability fixes. On paper, a routine release. Within days, the reports started coming in. Gamers running Nvidia GeForce graphics cards began noticing something was wrong. Frame rates had dropped noticeably across multiple titles and multiple game engines, not just one game or one genre. Users were reporting losses of 15 to 20 frames per second on hardware that had been running perfectly the day before. The 1% low frame rates, the metric that determines how smooth a game actually feels during its worst moments, had deteriorated even further. In some demanding games, the performance hit was significantly worse than those averages suggest. But frame rate drops were not the only symptom. Players also began reporting visual artifacts, strange rectangular shapes, banding, graphical corruption appearing during fast-moving scenes. Intermittent black screens started showing up, sometimes requiring a full reboot to clear. In some cases, the GPU driver itself was crashing under load, with event logs pointing to errors in Nvidia's display driver component. Professional users running OpenGL-heavy applications encountered GPU deadlocks that required forced power shutdowns to escape. People working in 3D applications reported that their workflows had become completely unstable overnight. The pattern was consistent and reproducible. Install KB507-4109, problems appear. Uninstall it, problems disappear. What made this especially frustrating is that Microsoft's official documentation for KB507-4109 listed no known gaming performance issues whatsoever. Users were watching their hardware degrade, running their own tests, and getting no acknowledgement from the company responsible. It was Nvidia, not Microsoft, that stepped up publicly. A staff member at Nvidia responded to user complaints on the official GeForce forums, confirming the company was actively investigating. The message was blunt: removing KB507-4109 was the only known way to reliably resolve the problem. Nvidia also pushed out new driver builds in an attempt to patch around whatever the Windows update had broken. But the driver updates produced mixed results. In many configurations, the only clean fix remained: removing the Windows update itself. This left users in an impossible position. KB507-4109 was a mandatory security update. It addressed over 100 known vulnerabilities. Uninstalling it meant accepting real security exposure, but keeping it installed meant degraded performance or outright instability. The Microsoft had forced people to choose between their security and their hardware functioning correctly. The issue appeared to be specific to Nvidia hardware. AMD Radeon users largely did not report the same problems. Technical analysis pointed toward an interaction between the update's changes to Windows display and presentation stack, and how Nvidia's driver handles certain operations. Things like scheduler behavior, memory management, and API calls that matter heavily in 3D rendering. The exact mechanism was never publicly explained by Microsoft. The gaming degradation was visible and widespread. But running alongside it was a more severe problem that Microsoft handled quietly, in ways that raised serious questions about transparency. Going back to the December 2025 update cycle, a small number of commercial Windows 11 devices had encountered a botched installation, one that left those machines in an inconsistent internal state. The systems appeared to be running normally at first. The real trouble came when the January 13th update, KB507-4109, arrived. On those already compromised machines, the January update triggered complete boot failures. Users would power on their machines and be greeted by a black screen and a message saying their device had run into a problem and needed to restart. The specific technical error was unmountable underscore boot underscore volume, a Windows stop code that means the operating system can no longer access the drive it needs to start up. These machines could not boot at all. Recovery was not straightforward. The built-in recovery options on affected devices frequently failed. The self-healing tool would report it could not complete. System restore points were sometimes missing. Users who did manage to reach a command prompt faced hours of manual repair attempts with uncertain outcomes. For enterprise customers managing fleets of devices, this was a significant operational problem. Microsoft released an optional non-security preview update on January 29th, KB507-4105, intended to prevent the boot failure from spreading to additional machines. This update also addressed the black screen issue that had been appearing at login and before the desktop would load. But it was partial mitigation at best. Machines that had already failed to boot before this update was released still required manual intervention. Here is the part that generated real criticism in the tech community. Microsoft did not post a public advisory about the boot failure issue. For most known Windows problems, the company publishes a notice in its Windows Release Health dashboard and updates the documentation for affected updates. For this boot failure, the advisory was distributed only through private enterprise channels. It only surfaced publicly because a security researcher saw the documentation and reported on it. The average consumer whose machine had suddenly stopped booting after a Windows update would have had no way to find official guidance unless they happened to be talking to an enterprise support channel. The February 10th update, KB507-7181, was presented as the fix. Microsoft stated in its advisory that the boot failure issue was fully resolved in this release. For machines that had already become unbootable, Microsoft directed enterprise customers to contact business support for assistance. The company acknowledged that home users did not appear to have been affected by the boot failure specifically. It was concentrated in commercial deployments. KB507-7181 arrived on February 10th, 2026. It was supposed to draw a line under the chaos of the previous 6 weeks. Within days, new reports were emerging. Some users who installed KB507-7181 found their machines entering restart loops, unable to complete the update installation and reach the login screen. Reports described systems cycling through restarts more than 15 times before eventually landing on a broken login page that would not accept credentials. The error being logged was tied to the System Event Notification Service, a Windows component that handles login-related processes, reporting that a procedure it needed could not be found. Network connectivity was also broken for some users after the February update, with DHCP errors causing devices to lose their automatic network configuration. Users on those machines woke up to find their internet connections had simply stopped working. Additionally, some systems failed to install the update at all, returning error codes 0x800F0983 and 0x800F0991, errors that point to failures in the update installation process itself. To be precise about the scope, not everyone who installed KB507-7181 experienced these problems. The majority of installations appear to have been completed without incident, but the users who were affected were dealing with machines that had become partially or fully non-functional as a direct result of installing a Microsoft security update. And critically, Microsoft's own release notes for KB507-7181 stated the company was not aware of any known issues with the update, even as these reports were actively accumulating in public forums and on Microsoft's own support pages. The workaround being recommended to affected users was to uninstall KB507-7181, just as the workaround for the January problems had been to uninstall KB507-4109. For the second consecutive month, users with affected machines were being told to remove mandatory security updates from their systems. You could look at the events of January and February 2026 in isolation and call it an unusually bad stretch. But context matters. In the months before this stretch, Windows 11 had accumulated a significant list of update-related problems. The October 2025 update had introduced gaming performance regressions that required Nvidia to release a driver hotfix to work around. That same update broke localhost HTTP/2 connections, which disrupted developers running locally hosted applications. The November 2025 update continued to cause frame rate drops in games. The December 2025 update, the very one that created the inconsistent device state that would later cause January's boot failures, introduced its own set of issues including firewall configuration errors and RDP connectivity failures. A detailed retrospective published in January 2026 cataloged more than 20 significant update problems across the 2025 update cycle. That is not a minor product team struggling with edge cases. That is a systematic reliability problem with one of the most widely deployed pieces of software on the planet. Windows runs on over 1 billion active devices. The scale means that even a failure rate of a fraction of 1% represents millions of machines. Millions of people dealing with systems that don't boot, games that don't run correctly, applications that crash, networks that stop working. These are not abstract statistics. They are people's work machines, their production equipment, their children's homework computers, their gaming setups. The update model itself deserves scrutiny. Microsoft pushes monthly cumulative updates that are mandatory for security reasons, which is reasonable on its face. Security patches matter. But the coupling of security fixes with system changes, the fact that a single mandatory update can simultaneously address a zero-day vulnerability and, as a side effect, restructure how the display stack interacts with GPU drivers means users cannot selectively apply security fixes without taking on whatever else the cumulative package contains. When those additional changes introduce regressions, users face a genuine dilemma. Uninstall the update and you lose the security coverage. Keep it installed and your hardware is degraded or unstable. Microsoft's testing processes are supposed to catch these regressions before they reach users. When updates reach 1 billion machines and the problems only manifest in a fraction of configurations, comprehensive testing is genuinely difficult. That is an honest technical challenge. But the frequency of these incidents suggests that whatever testing and rollout process Microsoft is running is not adequate for the scale of its deployment. The transparency problem compounds the trust problem. Not publishing a public advisory about a known boot failure bug when the standard practice is to publish exactly that kind of advisory. There is the kind of decision that, when it comes to light, tells users that their interests are not being prioritized over Microsoft's preference to manage the narrative quietly. For people currently running Windows 11, a few things are worth knowing coming out of this situation. If you are running an Nvidia GPU and have experienced frame rate drops, graphical artifacts, or instability since January 2026, the January update KB50741009 is the likely culprit. The February 10th update, KB50777181, contains additional fixes and represents the intended resolution path. But as we have discussed, that February update has introduced its own problems for a subset of users. Checking the Windows Release Health dashboard at the Microsoft website is the most current way to see what issues are officially acknowledged. If you installed KB50777181 and your machine entered a restart loop, the recommended workaround is to uninstall that update through either the normal update history and settings, or if you cannot reach the desktop, through the Windows recovery environment using command line tools. Microsoft's community support pages have documentation for this process. Pausing Windows updates temporarily is an option available in Windows settings. And in the current climate, it is not an unreasonable choice to wait a few weeks after a major update release to see what problems surface. The trade-off is real. Security patches matter, and delaying them carries risk. But so does being on the leading edge of a broken rollout. Maintaining a system backup or restore point before installing major updates is something that has always been good practice and has become more obviously important given recent history. Microsoft pushed out a January security update that broke gaming performance for a significant number of Nvidia users and triggered boot failures on devices that had been left in a compromised state by a previous update. It handled the boot failure issue without public disclosure, drawing justified criticism. The February update meant to fix those problems arrived and introduced new ones, restart loops, broken logins, lost network connections. Microsoft has since stated that the boot issue is fully resolved for systems that install the February update successfully. Einstein, the company, is presumably working toward acknowledging and addressing the new issues KB5077181 has introduced. These things will get fixed. They always do, eventually. But the pattern keeps repeating, and at some point, the question is not whether Microsoft can fix a broken update. It is whether the testing, rollout, and communication processes around Windows updates are appropriate for software that runs on this many machines that people's lives and work depend on, and that installs itself automatically. That question does not have a satisfying answer yet.